Our passage this morning is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 12. Remember that 2 weeks ago we began our study of 1 Thessalonians. We looked at the background and founding of the church there by Paul and Silvanus and Timothy. And we looked at verse 1 on that first week of our study. Last week we looked at Paul and his co-workers' thanksgiving for this Thessalonian church, for these believers. It was a thanksgiving toward God and through prayer. It was a thanksgiving prompted by their remembrance of the Thessalonians and their practice of these three key Christian virtues. Their faith was producing work. Their love was producing labor, even to the point of fatigue. And their hope was sustaining them and producing endurance, even as they faced persecution. It was also a thanksgiving to God caused by the missionaries knowing of God's elective choice, a choice that God made before the foundation of the world. Paul and his co-workers knew of this choice of the Thessalonians by their own impressions as they preached the gospel there. They sensed the power of the Holy Spirit as they proclaimed the message of Christ without any doubt or reservation. They also knew of God's choice of the Thessalonians through the effect that the message had on these people. They had turned from serving idols to serving the one true living God, and they were experiencing a joy that they had not had before, even as they were being persecuted for this new message that they had embraced. They became witnesses and examples, not only in the provinces of Macedonia and Achaia, their city was located in Macedonia, but wherever the report of their transformation reached, people were hearing about this, and they were telling the Apostle Paul even before he could tell them of the dramatic change that had taken place amongst them. They now lived in the expectation of the return of Christ, who would deliver them from the coming wrath that will take place in the day of the Lord. Now, as we get to chapter 2, we see that Paul takes a significant turn in his letter. He's going to spend the next 2 chapters vindicating his ministry to these new believers. Why would he need to do this? Well, as we've already seen, Paul and his co-workers faced strong opposition when they preached the gospel there in Thessalonica. Strong opposition from the Jews. So much so that the Jews pursued them into the next town, into Berea, which was about 40 miles away. They ended up chasing Paul out of there as well. So at that point, they would have returned to Thessalonica and do everything that they could to undercut Paul's ministry. Evidently, the report that Timothy brought back from Thessalonica and that prompted this letter by Paul included concerns about charges that had been made against Paul and against his co-workers. You can think about what those charges might have been. They would have pointed out the fact that Paul and his companions had left town very quickly after trouble arose, and therefore they did not really care about the Thessalonians. They would have charged that this message of salvation by grace through faith was a deceitful trick, and that these missionaries were proclaiming such a message simply to gain honor for themselves and for financial gain. That would not have been a hard charge for them to make, because there were lots of wandering philosophers and teachers, and many of them were corrupt. Many of them did preach a false message and did so strictly to try to fleece people. Now, if the Thessalonians were to believe these accusations about Paul, it could cause them to doubt Paul's message and make shipwreck of their faith. So Paul needs to assure the Thessalonians of his love and his concern for them and their spiritual welfare, and that's really what he's doing in chapters 2 and 3. It's a significant portion of this letter. His appeal will largely be a reminder of the manner of life that he and his companions had while they were there among them, something that his readers were very familiar with, and therefore a strong defense. They're not having to rely on a secondary report. They saw Paul and Silvanus and Timothy. They knew what kind of men they were. These chapters also give us a glimpse into the inner thinking and motives of the Apostle Paul, a man to whom we all owe a great debt as the apostle to the Gentiles. We'll talk about that more later. This is the broad outline that we showed when we first started the letter. So now we're moving into a new section in chapters 2 and 3 where Paul is vindicating his ministry. We'll be there for the next several weeks. With that review, let's look now at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We'll look at verses 1 through 12. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you is not in vain. But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition. For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit, but just as we've been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who examines our hearts. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor do we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Having thus a fond affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behave toward you believers. Just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children, so that you may walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Now, before we break the passage down into 3 sections, I want to just make a few general observations, too, actually, to help us see how this connects with what we've already looked at. First, the for at the beginning of verse 1 in chapter 2 provides a connecting link between Paul's discussion and what he's going to talk about in chapters 2 and 3 with what he's already written about in chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. It's really an explanation of how his ministry produced the transformation that took place in the lives of these believers. And Paul will use some of the same things from chapter 1 to provide his defense against these accusations of his alleged ulterior motives. Second, in verses 1 through 12, Paul reminds the Thessalonians, and I mentioned this earlier, of the circumstances during his first visit that they themselves were already aware of. He uses these phrases like, just as you yourselves know. They did not have to rely on somebody else's report, and he's just reminding them of what they themselves had witnessed. And you see, as you read this passage, that he kind of goes back and forth describing what his ministry was not, and again, he's arguing against the false charges in that case, and what his ministry truly was. So first, his ministry was characterized by preaching replete with boldness. Here Paul speaking about the character of their ministry among them. Their coming had not been empty or vain or without content. On the contrary, their ministry had been and continued to be one of great courage and boldness. You remember what happened to Paul when he was in Philippi, just before he had come to Thessalonica. Acts 16 records this for us. When her masters, and that's the masters of the servant girl that had the demon spirit, Paul had cast it out. When her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs which it's not lawful for us to accept or observe, being Romans." That wasn't true, by the way. Paul never advocated revolutionary action like he is being charged with here. But the crowd rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore their robes off them and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. Of course, you know the story. They ended up being loosed from their bonds by an earthquake, which ultimately leads to the salvation of the Philippian jailer's family. But their beating and imprisonment was not only difficult physically for them, it was also a real humiliation. It was very much against Roman law because Paul was a Roman citizen. That's why Paul says what he does the next day when the magistrates sent word to release them from prison. Here's what Paul says in Acts 16:37. "They've beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now, are they sending us away secretly? No, indeed. But let them come themselves and bring us out." And the magistrates did. Now, this is just one of several instances that we read about in the New Testament where Paul seems to be getting the worst of things, and he turns the situation around. From Philippi, Paul and Silas made their way to Thessalonica, where they proclaimed the gospel amid stiff opposition again. Keep in mind now, as they come to Thessalonica, they're still suffering from the wounds that were inflicted upon them, and no doubt those wounds were visible and somewhat of a warning that, hey, if you embrace this message, here's kind of what you can expect. Most people would have refrained from repeating a message like that. They brought that kind of mistreatment. But it did not deter these missionaries. They continued to speak with great boldness and without fear of the consequences. It was a boldness that came from God and again served as evidence of their sincere desire for the Thessalonians to know Christ. Secondly, their ministry was characterized by preaching removed from falsehood. This is in verses 3 and 4. The boldness that Paul had just described was possible because God, who knows the hearts of all men, had approved their fitness as stewards of the gospel. In these verses, Paul's moving beyond just what the Thessalonians could know or did witness to what God himself knows. In verse 3, he responds to allegations that their opponents had made against them regarding their motives and their proclamation of the gospel. First, their message was not one of error, but of truth. Truth from the ultimate source of truth. Truth from God himself as the one true God. Second, their message was not one of impurity. And that again would have been a common charge against these wandering teachers. Sexual immorality was a common problem among traveling religious teachers, and the enemies of the missionaries appear to have charged them with that conduct. Paul denies any such motive for himself or his companions, and there's no surprise that Paul would have wanted to distinguish himself from these kind of men. They were common in his day, and Paul's ministry was one of great integrity and stood in sharp contrast to other kinds of religious teachers. Third, their message was not one of deceit. They were not trying to play tricks on others in any way, and they were not making empty promises or following cleverly devised schemes. They wanted their hearers to fully and accurately understand the message, and they presented the facts of the case as they truly were. Now, in contrast to these false accusations, the motives and message of the missionaries was such that it was approved by an omniscient God. The idea here of approved has the idea of passing a test. And after calling Paul on the road to Damascus, God had subjected him to rigorous testing so that he could show he was fit for the task. Having prepared Paul in this way, God approved him as the apostle to the Gentiles. And it's on the basis of this approval by God that Paul conducted his ministry. He knew that God was the one that examined him, not just on the outside, but even his entire being, his inner man. God was the one, therefore, that he sought to please. And this was not just true of his ministry at Thessalonica, but everywhere that he went. He appeals to this as evidence that his character and ministry were sincere. Now, thirdly, their ministry was characterized by preaching reinforced with godly concern. And this is the bulk of our passage this morning in verses 5 through 12. In those verses, Paul continues his defense by pointing out their godly concern for the Thessalonians. Again, he first refutes the charge of impure motives in verses 5 through the first part of verse 7, and then he explains the way things really are in the last part of verse 7 through verse 12. First, their ministry was evidenced by the absence of wrong motives. Paul lists three things here that did not characterize the missionaries coming to the Thessalonians. First, he says they did not come with flattering speech. Now, we hear that term flattery when we normally think of it as saying nice things to people, whether they're really true or not, in order to kind of gain an advantage over them. And that could be part of what they're talking about here that these guys did. But the term in Greek also includes the smooth-tongued discourse of the orator, to impress, to gain advantage over people for selfish reasons. There were plenty of people, again, who did that in Paul's day. Oratory was highly regarded among the Greeks, and they continued, and that continued among the Romans. Paul says they were never guilty of this kind of thing. And this is not the only place where he had denied this kind of approach. In 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 5, he says this to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, he says this. When I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom. That's the kind of flattery he's talking about back in 1 Thessalonians. But in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Now, of course, his lack of oratory skills brought a different kind of charge towards him from the Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians 10:10, Paul again writes, "For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech contemptible." Because he wasn't a great orator, or because he didn't practice that kind of speech, they marked that against him. But Paul's method was consistently the same. He was committed to truth that was plainly spoken, apart from flattery or flourishing oratory. Second, they came with no pretext for greed. And again, the greed spoken of here is more than just a desire for money. We think of that as what greed means, and it does mean that. But greed is also a self-seeking of any type, anything that brings self-satisfaction. It grows from ignoring the interests and needs of others, something that's clear the missionaries were not guilty of. Now note who Paul appeals to as his witness for this, God himself. That makes sense because only God knows the desires of our heart. Certainly those desires show up in the way that we behave, but for somebody to really know the inner person, the inner motives, only God can do that. It also demonstrates how serious Paul is. When you appeal to God as your witness, that's a pretty serious thing to say. And it shows how serious he is in defending himself against these charges. Thirdly, their ministry was not seeking glory from men. As we've already noted, the world of Paul's time was filled with these wandering philosophers, religious and false prophets, magicians, and others who sought not only financial gain, but also just a good reputation. They sought honor from men. But Paul and his companions were not in that group. They sought instead the approval of God. As apostles of Christ, and as having been commissioned by Christ for the work in which they were doing, they were worthy of respect, but they didn't insist on that. They gave that up. And this too gave evidence of their pure motives. Now, having established the absence of false motives, Paul's now ready to describe the picture as it really is. He's certain that the Thessalonians will agree with his own assessment, using phrases like, "you remember," "you were witnesses," "you know." While ministering among the Thessalonians, Paul's companions were gentle, not authoritarian. They laid aside their right to be respected and treated the Thessalonians with the utmost gentleness. And he uses the illustration here of a nursing mother caring for her own children. It emphasizes a special effort to protect and provide for every need. Now, obviously, we don't appreciate that as much when we're the babies or very young children even. I'm not sure I appreciated it as much when my own children were growing up, but now as I watch my daughter care for her children, I see that a lot more clearly. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and energy to care for children in this way, and even to the point of sacrificing yourself. And Paul's using that as an illustration of the kind of love and care that he and Silvanus and Timothy had for these Thessalonian believers. They loved them so much that they did more than just give them a message. As important as that message was, it was the gospel message. It was the means by which they had come to know Christ. But these missionaries were pleased to impart their very lives to them, more than just their physical lives, but the depths of their being. They had become very dear to them. They had become beloved to them. And in that love was the motivating force for their behavior. It was the same kind of labor of love that we saw Paul himself commend the Thessalonians for in chapter 1. Now, verse 9 explains just one way that the missionaries gave their lives. It was through their working to support themselves that they might offer the gospel free of charge to the Thessalonians and not be a burden to anyone there. They worked both during the day and during the night, facing hardship in the process and laboring to the point of exhaustion. We know that Paul's work was tent making. That was a good occupation for him to have because he could use that no matter where he traveled across the Roman Empire. But it was a work that was painstaking. It took a lot of time. And what's evidenced here is that Paul gave up sleep at night in order to be able to make tents and support himself so as not to be a burden to any of his hearers. And again, this is just further evidence of the missionaries' unselfishness, which was a result, really, of their own transformation that had taken place through the gospel. Now, in verse 10, Paul reminds the Thessalonian believers that they had been witnesses of all of this and had God himself. So this is a case where both the Thessalonians and God had seen these things firsthand. They knew the character of Paul and his companions was devout, upright, and blameless. In a word, irreproachable. Paul had already spoken of the tender care that he had showed, like a mother caring for her children. But a family, by God's design, has a father and a mother. And they're two very different roles. Both are necessary for the rearing of children who are mature and well-rounded adults. So now Paul begins to speak of the individual fatherly instruction that he provided to each one of these believers. It's a picture of education and discipline, governed by love and according to the needs of each one. This fatherly instruction included admonishment to follow the right course. It included comfort, that is, admonishment in such a way that these people actually wanted to follow his instruction. And it included urging, necessary to keep them on track. It denotes a seriousness of what they needed to do. The purpose of this instruction was so that the Thessalonians might walk in a manner worthy of God, that is, live lives that were in consistency with God's standards. Now, Paul uses this kind of admonition in his other letters as well, some of which we've looked at. Galatians 5:25 speaks as, if we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. Ephesians 4:1, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, entreat you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called. Philippians 1:27, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. It's really a great way to summarize in one sentence what our responsibility is as Christians. Christ has bought us with a price. He's paid precious blood for us, and our only reasonable response is to walk in a manner that's pleasing to him. The incentive for this kind of life is the call of God into his kingdom and glory. And Paul here, of course, is talking about the consummation of God's program, the return of Christ as the Messiah, his worldwide reign and the glory of God that will accompany that return, culminating in a new heavens and new earth where there's no more curse, no more pain, no more tears, and no more death. So what Paul is doing here, and this is the way eschatology is supposed to function, he's pointing towards that future bliss in order to sustain them in their present persecution. The Thessalonians, and we hear this morning, who are believers in Christ, had already heard and responded to the call of God, the initial call of God through the gospel. And that is the means by which we become citizens of the kingdom. That happens at a point in time. But God's call is an ongoing call. It's an ongoing call to growth, to increasing sanctification, to endurance when we face difficulties in this life. And it's a call to keeping on until Christ returns. Now, I want to just summarize some lessons that we can learn from what we've looked at this morning, even going back some to chapter 1. I mentioned earlier the debt that we all owe to the Apostle Paul. I'm not sure that we always think about this, but this passage that we look at this morning gives us some real insight into his own character and into his own motives. What drove him as an apostle for Christ and a minister for the Lord. He was, by his own admission, the chief of sinners before he was saved because he was a blasphemer and a persecutor of Christians. Yet God, in his great grace, dramatically saved Paul on the road to Damascus and commissioned him as the apostle to the Gentiles. It was both his responsibility and his passion to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. And because he did that, Christianity first spread across the Roman Empire, and then from there across the world, and at some point in time to each one of us. Paul is very important because God gave him so much revelation about the church and used him to write much of the New Testament. For every one of us here this morning, we're the beneficiaries of that as a follower of Christ. It's through the experience and the writing of Paul that we understand who Christ is, what God has done for us through the finished work of Christ, how we're to live in the present age, and the great future that we have as Christians when Christ returns in glory, and we as the sons and daughters of God are revealed with him in glory. Secondly, consider the power of witness of a transformed life lived faithfully for Christ. Now, I'm sure that the Thessalonian believers were telling other people about Christ and sharing the gospel with people. I don't have any doubt about that. But it was really their changed lives that was being broadcast across the Roman Empire. They had worshipped idols before, and now they were worshiping the true God. And that had changed their lives. It had completely changed their manner of life. You can see this also in the lives of Paul and his co-workers. They had come from a very different background than most of these Thessalonian believers, but their work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope, even as they ministered among the Thessalonians, was showing up in their lives. In fact, it is the character and conduct of their lives that Paul appeals to as he makes his defense. And that is the character and conduct that God had wrought in their lives through the power of the gospel. In the same way, it's the witness of the way that we live day in and day out that provides the hope, or provides the opportunity to share the hope that's within us. Third and finally, there's a future bliss that awaits us, which serves as present motivation for us to walk in a manner worthy of God. We know that future from the Word of God itself, and we're responsible to study that, to understand it. Much of our instruction in the epistle speaks of waiting, enduring, remaining steadfast, all of which are motivated by that future reward, that future return of Christ. So in light of that, let me encourage you and encourage myself as well to walk in a manner worthy of God until Christ comes for us in the glory of his kingdom. Let's pray together and then we'll sing a closing song.